Today we're taking a look at Walmart. This time around we're going to do focaccia bread, and we're just doing the top shelf against the bottom shelf ingredients. On the left we're going to have the bottom shelf, on the right will be the top shelf. The prices will be placed beneath each item as they're showing up. Only discrepancy here in the ingredients this time around will be the vinegar and these two Italian seasonings. The vinegar on the top shelf side is actually from Italy, and then the Italian seasonings we ended up taking them out completely because they did not taste very good in the dipping sauce we made with oil and balsamic vinegar after. Starting us off, we've got the all-purpose flour from Great Value. It looks like it normally has, and we really wanted to focus on this recipe, the differences, to see if the flour changed anything. In the past with the cookies and the other recipes we've made with these, we haven't been able to tell much of a difference except for color. Even in the waffles, I wouldn't say the flour was a differentiating factor, so we're trying more simple recipes with it. Next we have our salt, and the salt here, I really can't tell any difference between it except for the price. The Morton salt's twice as expensive, but it's only 50 cents, so you can spend your heart out if you'd like on that and splurge, and you might break the bank, but it might be worth it. Next is the yeast, and the Great Value yeast and the name brand yeast, they're different. Surprisingly, the Great Value yeast ended up having like rod-shaped little dry bits in there, and the name brand was little round pellets. Didn't think there was any difference and you could really change anything with yeast, but apparently there is a difference between the name brand and the store brand here. Added in the water to let it bloom, and the recipe we were following said to turn the water up to about 95 degrees and let it sit for 10 minutes, and we did that on both of them the best we could. This recipe didn't turn out great, so our final product is actually a more simple recipe that's not needed in the stand mixer. This is basically the same steps that I took, but we ended up using a new dough and a new recipe, and I'll kind of go into that more in just a minute. The next step, we're gonna look at this oil, and this name brand olive oil was so much better than the Great Value. I really didn't think there was going to be any difference the first time I thought of this, because I thought olive oil is olive oil, you know, if it's extra virgin it's going to be the first pressing. I could not have been more wrong. It was so much more fruity, almost like just a deeper taste to it. And then my wife kind of described the taste of the Great Value olive oil as like dusty. It seemed like it was almost a little rancid and expired, even though it was brand new. This first set of dough made with the bottom shelf ingredients was a little runny and a little too hydrated. Seemed like it was a 50-50 hydration dough when it should have been like a 40-60. So it was a little too wet, and if I would have had to knead it by hand, it would not have come off the counter. And then going on to the next one, it ended up being a bit of a drier, tighter dough, which was kind of good. But again, neither of these turned out well. We followed the recipe to a T, stuck them in the fridge, and left them overnight to kind of continue fermenting to give them a nice, good fermented taste. A little like sourdough almost. When I put them into the pans here, it punched them down as the recipe calls for, and they never recovered. It seems like our fridge either the yeast into a deep sleep or just completely killed it, or they didn't have anything to eat while they were in the bread, so the yeast ended up dying. But even after 3 hours of sitting outside of the fridge, nothing changed on them, and I think what happened is that it was just totally dead. Releasing from the bowls was just fine because I greased them, but I ended up not greasing the pan on the right very well. And so it looks fine here, and it looks like it's gonna get fried like you'd expect focaccia to be in the oven, but you can kind of see it sticking on the edges there, and it was just glued to it by the end. So I definitely would not recommend doing that. And make sure you oil the pan very well. And my double thumbs down there is just related to the fact that neither of these dimpled well. No matter what I could do, nothing was staying. They stretched way too easily as well. Typically when I've made focaccia bread, it's really kind of hard and you have to let it rest for like 10 to 15 minutes in the pan to get it to stretch out to the corners, and this happened immediately. So I was already suspicious it wasn't going to turn out good. To top it all off, we put some flaky salt on both of them. Turns out Walmart really doesn't have fancier salt. You can either get the pink Himalayan salt, table salt, or stuff you grind up in a grinder, which doesn't really interest us at all. So we just went with the flaky salt on both of them to make it even. And these are the cooked ones from a different batch that we made. On the left, we've got our Great Value, and it looks really good. They do look a little bit different here. The one on the right looks a little more like a cracker, and that's mostly due to the size of the pan we cooked them in. We only have 2 of these half sheet pans, and we wanted to cook these pretty quickly. So the one on the right is just a little bigger. It does look like it's deeper on the left, but when you look at these cross sections, the one on the right, you can see there was some pretty good bubbles on it, but it's still kind of a dense bread, which focaccia is supposed to be a little airier than this. And when the two are compared, they're both fairly dense. At some points, I would say the one on the bottom looks even better than the one on the top, but on the top there it looks like it did ferment a bit better. So it wasn't the best bread I've ever made, but it was still turned out acceptable. And I felt like this was a fair comparison with it. We made this dipping sauce to kind of just see if it's worth, you know, the olive oil really is worth it. I know we fried the bread in it, but it's always kind of nice to see when you dip into it, because kind of the best part of focaccia, it's just a vessel for more delicious things. We started trying the name brand focaccia and immediately could tell it was nice and crispy and then nice and soft on the inside. That outer layer was so good, just almost had like a deep fried feel to it. And the balsamic vinegar and olive oil tasted fantastic. Switching over to the bottom shelf bread, and they both looked really similar, and the texture was a little bit different on the lower or the bottom end ingredients, and it did not taste as good. It wasn't really even close. It just tasted like there was nothing backing it up, is the best way I can describe it. It wasn't deep, it was a really shallow, just bready taste, and it was pretty boring. And when you put it right next to the top shelf stuff, it really showed how much was lacking. And then the other funny part with this is the dipping sauce. The olive oil on the top shelf ingredients was so much better. And honestly, the price difference is probably worth it. It's 3 times the price, but it's like 5 times better. So I would definitely go for the more expensive olive oil if you can afford it. And it really does a better job with everything. To answer that question of is it better? I would say yes, go for the top shelf ingredients. The bread tasted better on its own. I think that was due to the flour more than anything. So I will say King Arthur does taste better. And then the olive oil for the top shelf was so much better. I don't even know where to start with how much better that olive oil was. And that's all we've got. If you like what you're doing, let us know. Drop us a suggestion. Like the video, subscribe, and we've got another one coming out next week. Thanks so much.